Hello, Graham.
Hello.
How are you this evening, or in the morning where you are?
It's in the morning. It's about 6 o'clock, and I'm not quite sure how long I'm going to stay on because there'll be kids running around getting ready to go to school soon. But I'll do my best.
Great, that sounds good to me. I was just informing my audience that you are the first guest I've had in about 6.5 years of being on air. A subject other than reading the book, I don't know that much about the King Arthur legend other than some bits and pieces. So hopefully you can give us a great deal of information and inform us about this new book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your biography and what got you interested in the subject all the way back in the early 90s?
Well, I was a journalist, and I began to investigate various political mysteries to start off with, but eventually I became rather hooked on the idea of various historical artifacts that had been lost and historical legends, whether they were true or not. I think it was the Indiana Jones films that kind of got me into that kind of thing. And eventually I started to look into various mysteries, such as was there a real character behind the legend of Robin Hood? And I looked into the mystery of the Holy Grail and the Ark of the Covenant, just as Indiana Jones does in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and started to follow a series of clues as to where the lost Ark might have ended up. So that's how I got into it. But back in 90, Legend of Robin Hood, 90, it was the King Arthur legend that began to enthrall me the most because it was something that was probably known throughout the world, something that had been kicking around for centuries, and yet no one really had come up with any solid proof that there was a real historical King Arthur behind the legend, although many scholars suspected there was, and certainly no one had managed to discover where this character, if he existed, was buried. Hence, I decided to eventually, when this book came out after years of research, call the book The Lost Tomb of King Arthur.
Now, in the beginning of the book, you wrote about this find back in the 1100s, the possibility that there maybe was a tomb of King Arthur and his queen Guinevere, but that maybe was a hoax of some sort. You explain that in the book. What is the? Because I know some people might have heard about that. That is from your research a hoax, however.
Yes, in the 1190s, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey, which is in the southwest of England, claim to have dug up King Arthur's grave. The reason they claim it was his is because, along with the skeleton, there was a lead cross that had been inscribed. It had been buried with the bones. The lead cross inscribed with the Latin inscription, which roughly translates as, "Here lies the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon." Now, Avalon was the legendary place that he was supposed to have been laid to rest. But there was a number of things that made me suspicious that this was in fact a hoax by the monks in order to attract visitors to the abbey, pilgrims, in other words, who would bring donations with them. And perhaps no longer is the cross available for us to examine today, or the bones. They've been lost over the centuries. But the cross inscribed saying, "Here lies the famous King Arthur," um, just sounds a bit wrong. I mean, for example, you wouldn't have the grave of George Washington saying, "Here lies the famous George Washington," because when he died, everybody'd know who he was. You certainly won't have a grave when our Queen Elizabeth dies, saying, "Here lies the famous Queen Elizabeth." It's almost as if it was put there later. And also it says in the Isle of Avalon. So it would be like saying, I'm not quite sure where George Washington's laid to rest, but it wouldn't say, "Here lies the grave of George Washington in the state of Pennsylvania," or wherever he is. I mean, because everybody would know that. So the whole thing sounds a bit kind of hoax-like to
And,
me.
and these monks also had a little bit of a history of finding some other bones, didn't they?
Yeah, it isn't that just Arthur's bones they found. They claim to have found the bones, for example, of St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. And of course, the Irish went mad at this, saying, "Hold on, he's been buried here for centuries. You can't claim to have found him." Then after that, they claimed to have found another saint's bones that were actually buried near London, and the Archbishop in England, the top church guy, basically sort of told them to stop claiming to find saints' bones, and so they turned to King Arthur instead.
Well, at the time, though, nobody had claimed to have found a tomb or the remains of a King Arthur. So this sort of seemed like it was perhaps less than a hoax, that it maybe was real, because I don't think anybody had claimed it prior to the 1190s, right?
No, and there's not many people claimed it since until I've come along. But the whole question is whether the actual legend of King Arthur was based on an historical figure. The legend goes that it first appeared in the 1100s in popular literature, that King Arthur had united the Britons in around the year 500, so many centuries before that, in an attempt to stop the invasion of Britain by the Anglo-Saxons who actually came from Germany. The British were Celts. Um, and it was also Britain was divided into separate kingdoms then, and to unite them all as one kingdom, this man called Arthur came along. And okay, that don't sound too over the top, but then as the story went by along, as the years went by, more and more aspects were added to the tale. For example, Arthur ends up fighting dragons, rescuing damsels in distress. There are wizards and magic added to the story, which all made it sound very unbelievable. So, of course, these days, many scholars would turn around and say, well, of course, it wasn't King Arthur who did all those kind of things.
So even though there may have been a legitimately physical King Arthur that did exist, the story of King Arthur was sort of romanticized, and there were several aspects added to it, fictitious aspects, mythological aspects, the stories, as you said, of slain dragons, damsels in distress. All of that was sort of added to this story over time, and it was just compounded until it became what we have today.
Exactly. So, what I actually wanted to try and do is to peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak, and try and get back to the very original story and find out if it was fanciful or if there seems to have been some historical basis for it. And discovered that in the 830s, one of the earliest accounts of Arthur's life is found in the work of a monk named Nennius, who wrote during what's called the Dark Ages. And in Britain, the Romans had ruled this country until the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 400s. And then you've got a period called the Dark Ages where law and order collapses because the Roman legions have left. And that goes on for a couple of hundred years until eventually the Anglo-Saxons finally invade Britain and found a new kingdom of England. But in this period called the Dark Ages, this monk called Nennius wrote this account saying that in 500 AD, or around that time, there had been a man called Arthur. Now, he talks about Arthur uniting the Britons, just as the later romantic tales tell us. And he talks about Arthur as an ordinary, everyday, down-to-earth warrior. He lists a series of successful battles he fought, and he tells us when Arthur lived. But other than this, he gives no elaboration. He doesn't go into the myths and the legends and the fanciful tales. In other words, he just records him in a book of history as a down-to-earth historical warlord, which
So,
made me think there might be some truth behind it.
so in that case, you have the story of an actual physical King Arthur, but there's no stories of Holy Grails, Excalibur, the Isle of Avalon, or anything like that.
Not in his account, no. So it was this Arthur I was decided to kind of search for. And the problem is about the Dark Ages in Britain is there are very few records that survive from that time to tell us about anybody of who did what to who and how, where and when, because the country was in such a mess for many years. These records haven't survived. So but what this monk Nennius does tell us is that Arthur was his most successful battle was a place called Baden, which seems to have been somewhere in the west of England. And that's the point where he eventually manages to force the Anglo-Saxons back for a while anyway. And within the living memory of the time that Arthur is said to have lived, that another monk, this kind called Gildas, writes about this battle of Baden occurring in 500 AD. So we know from somebody who lived at the time that the battle that Arthur is accredited to have led really did take place. Although Nennius, he's writing a book about other matters to do with the church, so he doesn't bother to go too much into military affairs, so it doesn't tell us who led the Britons, only that the Britons were victorious. So again, that gave further credence to the fact that Arthur was a real figure.
One of the things that I sort of realized, most of us have heard all of these names before and the different legends, but one of the things I realized reading the book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, is that you've got Excalibur, you've got the Holy Grail, you have Merlin, you have Avalon. There's so much incorporated into this multi-tiered, multi-leveled myth slash history slash literary tale that it almost seems too good to be true. So obviously there are so many different elements incorporated into it, but when I look at this, Graham, I just see so many different amazing stories and legends all incorporated into the same story, into the same legend. I mean, this seems to be one of the most significant, one of the most important legends of all time. I don't know, do you see it that way as well?
Yes, so it certainly is. I think one of the main reasons for this is that we think of Arthur now as being the king of Britain, or king of England. But at the time, these earliest references refer to him really as more like an emperor. The Roman Empire had collapsed; that had spread throughout the whole of Europe and beyond. And most of our modern culture in the West is based on what the Romans had done. Now, the Roman Empire collapsed for a whole host of reasons, and the last little bit of it was in Britain. And Arthur, as he's depicted in by these earliest writers, is a Roman-style warrior. If he lived in 500 AD, that's exactly what he'd have been. He'd have been wearing late Roman armor. He wouldn't have lived in a big Gothic castle. He'd have lived in a fortified city with wooden stockades around it. It would have been very different to the kind of person that we now imagine. Now, this person, because Britain is an island, when the rest of the empire was overrun by people from Eastern Europe, great invasion of the whole empire, Britain stayed free until the Anglo-Saxons eventually took over. And so it was the last enclave of the mighty Roman Empire, of this civilization which eventually sort of created, the world we know today in the West. And Arthur is considered as the last emperor, in a sense. So this is why once the law and order had collapsed in this country and Arthur was dead, the empire had gone. So Arthur wasn't just remembered as being, this guy had just united the people of Britain for a bit. He was considered to represent the last of all this civilization which had gone on for hundreds of years. And then for many centuries afterwards, Britain was in a right mess. And even it took many centuries before Europe was back on its feet again after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And Arthur was seen, not just in Britain, but in France and Germany and other places as well, as being what represented the fall of this mighty, once wonderful times.
There's a lot of other aspects to this story that that maybe are not historically accurate. So we know that there is more than likely, and there is reference to a historical King Arthur. However, the stories and legends of Excalibur or Camelot or Merlin, was Merlin a real person? Could we go through some of these other legends within the legend of King Arthur, and maybe explain, as you do in the openings to the book, the first couple of chapters, explain a little bit about Camelot, explain a little bit about Arthur's sword, maybe explain a little bit about Merlin, the court magician. Are these real places, or is this strictly mythology and legend?
There is a character called Merlin who's recorded at the same time as Arthur, but he doesn't seem to have been a magician. He seems to have been a shaman or holy man or somebody who was reported to perform miracles. Now, he wasn't the only one in this period who was said to have been able to heal the sick and cause people to have premonitions or visions. The people that did this were known as bards, and they were also court poets, incidentally. And one of the court poets of the period that Arthur is supposed to have lived is referred to as Merlin. His real name was actually Ambrosius. Merlin was something like a title. And this man is recorded as actually at one point being a warrior himself, fighting in the Roman army. But as he grew older, he then became advisor to Arthur, it would seem, and advised him on affairs of state and military matters. But I mean, when I say they were attributed with mystical powers, they certainly would have known about the properties of herbs and medicines. So they would have been able to cure people at a time when, as I say, the empire had collapsed.
And that seems like magic.
And that seemed magic at the time. They could probably also do what we would now call hypnotism, or they would know about hallucinogenic drugs. So, it's not surprising people claim to have seen all sorts of things like dragons with people like Merlin around. But moving on to Excalibur, that's a really interesting one, because that was one of the legends that I thought that's just made up, because in the story, when Arthur is dying on the field of battle, he asks one of his knights to throw his sword into a nearby lake. And when he does so, the arm of this mysterious nymph-like figure, this kind of mermaid person that lives in the lake, grabs the sword by the hilt and takes it down into the water. Now, okay, that sounds pretty crazy. But what is interesting is that we know from the Roman writers that the Britons of the period Arthur lived had a tradition that when an important warrior died, their sword would be thrown into a sacred pool or lake as an offering to a water goddess, so that their soul would be granted safe passage to the underworld. And we know that this is true because archaeology has unearthed the remains of many swords that had been thrown into lakes around this period. And, lakes have dried up over the years, and archaeologists are able to dig, and they found the swords that had been thrown in as these, what they call votive offerings. What is really interesting, that these were thrown as an offering to a water goddess. Her name is recorded as being Viviana, and the first reference to the name of the Lady of the Lake, this nymph that grabs the sword and takes it down into the water, is, in the Arthurian story, is Vivian. Vivian, Viviana. One's got to be based on the other. In other words, what were once the myths, legends, or religious beliefs of the Britons became incorporated into the story of Arthur in a kind of medieval magical sense.
And also, when we hear some of these old stories, sometimes we think of, let's say, a water goddess, a lake goddess, and we think a hand reaching up out of the water and grabbing the sword. That seems a little bit strange. That might seem a little bit crazy. But sometimes these stories were elaborately explained, and what they really were was an anthropomorphizing of this spirit that occupied the water, described as being somewhat humanoid, perhaps. Is there an element of that to it?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what's behind it. The Celtic people of Britain and elsewhere in Europe believed that lakes were sacred, and there was a goddess, I say this person called Viviana, who was said to reside in this lake and that could take on mortal form. So this is, I believe, where the Lady of the Lake story came from. You also asked about Camelot. Now that sounds, pretty far-fetched, this marvelous city. But it's been more and more elaborated over the centuries. But in the earliest tales, Camelot is said to have been the most powerful city in the country. It is the most sophisticated and well defended, and it's this where Arthur makes his seat of power. Now, if one would say, well, if you're looking for a historical King Arthur, then surely you can just go and find the place that's called Camelot and search, for evidence there. Well, no place in Britain still called Camelot survives. In fact, the name Camelot itself was an invention of a 12th century poet. He needed something to rhyme with the word Lancelot, hence Camelot. So whatever this place was called, it wasn't called Camelot. But the earlier references to Arthur do say he ruled from the capital of Britain in 500 AD. But they don't say what it was called. It seems that over the years, the name of this place had been forgotten during the Dark Ages. So, the capital of Britain at the time, it wasn't London, because London had been invaded by the Anglo-Saxons. And there were two second and third largest cities in Britain were also on the east side of the country, which had been overrun by the Anglo-Saxons, which left the fourth largest city in the country, a place called Viraconium, as the capital. Now, this was smack bang in the centre of England, and whereas places like Rome and London can now be found only in the ground, underneath roads, pavements, sidewalks, office buildings, Viraconium survives. The foundations and some of the walls of the city still survive in open countryside, in farmland. Because once it was eventually abandoned, it never continued on to become a modern city. And this has enabled archaeologists to examine the place much more thoroughly than any other place of the period. And they've discovered that around the year 500, this place was not only totally occupied still, where many other Roman towns were being abandoned for more easily defendable hilltop sites. This place was massively refortified, and at the centre of this city of Viraconium, there was erected what can only be described as some sort of palatial mansion, Roman style, which archaeologists say must have been the seat of an extremely important warlord, almost certainly because of the size of the city, whoever it was that united the Britons at the time of the Battle of Badon. Now, in other words, without saying it, the archaeologists have said that this was the seat of Arthur, because the only person who'd ever been associated with the Battle of Badon is Arthur himself. And if his name wasn't Arthur, whoever the Arthur legend was based on is the person for whom this new palatial mansion was built. And in fact, what's amazing is you can go to Viraconium now. You can see the ruined walls. You can see the foundations. It's a protected site. There's a little museum at the area which has on display many of the finds that have been made there. But you can actually walk around the city of the man who united the Britons to defeat the Anglo-Saxons in 500 AD, which is exactly what Arthur has done. So whatever this guy's name was, it is almost certain that the legend of Arthur came from the person who ruled there at the time.
If you're just joining us, you are listening to The Secret Teachings. I'm your host, Ryan Gable. Our guest this evening, Graham Phillips. The book is The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon. His website, grahamphillips.net. That's grahamphillips.net. It's also linked up on our website. Graham, going back to Excalibur for a second and also relating to the Anglo-Saxons, you have an interesting take and observational analysis about what the original words for Angles and for Saxons and the stone that the sword was pulled out of, or the anvil that the sword was pulled out of, in the famous legend of King Arthur. Could you explain that in a little detail? Because I thought that was really interesting, and it puts a whole new twist on simply pulling a sword out of a rock.
Yeah, the story that we all familiar with today is that Arthur pulls his sword to prove himself king. He has to pull a sword out of a stone or a rock. Now, one thing that people tend to get confused about nowadays is that the sword that Arthur pulls from the stone is not the same as Excalibur. That's a separate sword that Merlin takes him to receive from the Lady of the Lake in the Arthurian romantic story of the Middle Ages. The sword that was stuck in the stone was a completely different sword. What happened to that, we're not told. But the idea of the sword being stuck in a stone is also a later elaboration. In the original story, the sword is in an anvil, and the anvil is on top of a stone block, which sounds pretty weird. Why would Arthur have to put a sword from an anvil on top of a stone slab in order to prove himself king? It's almost, you're thinking that's a weird setup, but not if you consider that there's possibly been a mistranslation somewhere along the way. Now, the the Latin, a lot of people in the Dark Ages wrote in Latin, and the word for a large rock or stone altar or fragment is a in Latin is saxum, which sounds very similar to the word Saxon. And the word anvil was pretty much the same, anvil. So if you got Arthur, the original tale of Arthur, having to take the sword, i.e., the fight, from the Angles and Saxons, and later somebody mistranslated this into he had to take the sword literally from the stone and the anvil. That's possibly how this tale came about. Sorry, there's a lot of noise in the background because it's early in the morning here. Workmen have started digging up the road with a jackhammer, so you'll have to excuse that.
I don't hear much noise, but I'm
Oh, that's all right. And I apologise to your listeners for this.
That's okay. It's okay. I've adjusted some knobs. It's not that bad. I can't really hear much. It looks like we have a question from the chat room, and WJP asks, "What does the guest know about Machados, the King of Dragons?"
Absolutely nothing, I'm afraid.
Absolutely nothing. Oh, sorry about that, WJP. We actually have a call coming in right now. Let's go ahead and add. It looks like Ira is on the line. Ira, you are live with Graham Phillips on The Secret Teachings. Hello, Ira.
Not there.
Hello, Ira.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
I can.
Hello.
Yes.
This has really been a fascinating discussion so far. I've gotten a lot out of it, and I'm a big fan of the whole Arthur legend, the whole Arthur story. And you've definitely answered a lot of questions for me that I've had. So kudos to you, Ryan, for having him on tonight. This is awesome.
Do you have a question for Graham, Ira?
I do, yeah. What do you think? Now, this kind of maybe goes into very much opinion on your part, of course, but why do you think that people do get so fascinated with this whole Arthur legend? What's your take on the reason why we've been so, I don't know, enamored by it for so many years?
There's many reasons, I think. Obviously, the story was passed on by word of mouth for many years because Arthur represented this lost bygone age of the Roman Empire. And then what happened is in the Middle Ages, the people who ruled Britain were the French who ruled England. They had come over from Normandy. They were known as the Normans. They'd invaded this country in 1066. And they established their own aristocracy. And the people who they had conquered were the Anglo-Saxons, who had themselves previously conquered the Celts. Now, in order to get legitimacy from the church, in other words, the Pope, the kings of England wanted to prove that they had some divine right to rule. They'd just been descended from French noblemen and needed to prove that somehow they were descended from a legitimate kings of England. Now, they weren't descended from the Anglo-Saxons, who were German originally, but they could show that they were descended from the earlier Celts, many of whom had fled to northern France when the Anglo-Saxons finally invaded all of what's now England. So when the British kings in the 1100s suddenly discovered about these legends of the man called Arthur, who had been the nearest thing that they could imagine to a king of Britain, and certainly the last of them before the Saxons came, they thought, right, yeah, we can say we're descended from him. The Pope will be happy with that. But people knew very little about him. So they set up a kind of, I don't know, a ministry, if you like, whose job it was to find out all the legends, collect all the legends about Arthur from around the country, put them together and write, a definitive book about who he was. Well, obviously, this entailed a lot of myths and legends that had grown up over the years. So both history, myth and legend were put together in perhaps the first Arthurian romantic story that was written in the 1130s by a man called Geoffrey of Monmouth, whose job it was to find out about Arthur, to put this book together, to paint Arthur in the best possible light, and to popularize him. So the reason I think the whole thing really then started off is because Arthur had been used as a crucial figure in a medieval propaganda exercise.
Is there any way also, Graham, just as you mentioned, Merlin might have been a title, that King Arthur may have become a title and contributed to some of the legends and stories?
Yes, now that is fascinating, because when I decided to find out who had ruled, was there any records of the person who ruled from Viriconium at the time Arthur is said to have ruled from there? In other words, now we've got a place to associate Arthur with, which we wouldn't have known about until recently because of the archaeological work that's being done there. Was there a name of a person recorded anywhere of who ruled in 500? And there was. A series of genealogies, that's family trees, survive from that period that tell us the man that ruled from there was not called Arthur. He was called Owen Thangwyn. Now, I thought, Owen was a fairly common name, still is in many parts of Britain and other parts of the world. I thought, okay, so we've established that there was this powerful warlord, probably, well, say established probably, as much as you can, that ruled Britain at the time Arthur is said, and that he ruled from what could only be considered to be the most powerful city in the country, just like Arthur did. So if there is an Arthur, this is the man behind the legend. But his name was Owen, not Arthur. And at first that was disappointing, but then I discovered, and if you remember I mentioned this monk Nennius, who wrote about the Battle of Badon being real in the early 6th century, he tells us about the person who ruled from Viriconium in his time, and he tells us about Owen Thangwyn, but he doesn't refer to him as Owen, he refers to him by a title, and writing in Latin, that title was Ursus, which means the bear. Now, many Celtic kings at the time had the habit of adopting the names, or were given the names, the ceremonial names of animals that in some way represented their prowess. For example, the fox, if they were cunning, and Arthur was called the bear. But this is what the really fascinating bit is, when you translate the word bear back into Brythonic, which is the language spoken in Britain at Arthur, if there was an historical Arthur during his time, the word for a bear is Arth, A-R-T-H. And strangely, it still survives today in modern Welsh, a Celtic country in Britain. So the fact that the person who ruled from the most powerful city in the country, at the time Arthur is said to have ruled from the most powerful city in the country, was actually named Arth, which could easily have turned into Arthur, as far as I was concerned, had pretty much proved that Arthur was real, who he was, and where he came from.
Ira, do you have any other comments or questions for Graham?
That'll do it. But thank you so much again for being here and for answering my questions. I appreciate it.
That's my pleasure, sir.
All right,
you guys have a great night.
You too, Ira.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. That's pretty interesting, Graham. Are there any other finds like that you think are really significant that might be relevant to discuss this evening? We already talked about the the anvil and the stone, or the Saxum, and we just, as you mentioned, the story of Arth and the bear. Are there any other finds that are really significant that might have been overlooked?
And what's probably the most fascinating, haunting aspect of the King Arthur story is what happens when he dies. He is said to, when the knight has thrown his sword to the lake, he returns to where Arthur's body is lying. Arthur's lying, dying, to find that Arthur has either died or he's gone into unconsciousness, and his body has been moved onto a boat and sailed across, we are told, a lake to the Isle of Avalon. And it is on this island that he's said to be buried. Now, the island of Avalon is something which many people have thought was just a myth. Why would he be buried on an island in the middle of a lake? But what's fascinating is and again, it's only just now, after all these centuries, that archaeology is beginning to piece this together to make the story of Arthur more realistic. As I mentioned before, the archaeologists are finding evidence that swords were thrown into lakes as votive offerings to a water goddess. By the same token, we know from archaeology that the Celts of Britain 1,500 years ago used to bury their sacred dead on islands in the middle of lakes. These islands were very often the home of monastic orders, at that time, 1,500 years ago, the religion that was practiced by the people of Britain was kind of a halfway between Christianity, which the Romans had adopted in the end of their time, and paganism. So you've got gods and goddesses being venerated alongside saints and Jesus and the Virgin Mary. It was quite odd. So you've got these islands with on them are recorded as living communities of nuns, half pagan, half Celtic, and they tended to be, we are told, 9 sacred women or priestesses lived on these islands. Now, what we're told in the Arthurian story is that Arthur is taken to be buried on the Isle of Avalon, which is guarded by these 9 maidens. So you've actually got a tie-up there with the historical period many hundreds of years before these tales were written. And so Avalon, it seems, and as I say, from the archaeological point of view, we know that these islands were used for the burial of important figures at the time Arthur is said to have lived. So even Avalon itself might have been a real place.
Yeah, but then again, over time, of course, as you said earlier, islands may sink into water. Water dries up. It's very difficult 1,500 years ago to investigate that type of story, I would think, Graham.
It is, and I went looking to. Luckily enough, a particular work does survive that tells us where, on what particular island, the kings who ruled from Viriconium were buried. It says that they were buried at a place called the Churches of Bassa. Now, this work still survives in Oxford University Library even today. And it tells us that they're buried on a place called the Churches of Bassa. Right near Viriconium, there is a place called Bass Church. Bass Church, Churches of Bassa, it's so similar that one must be the other. And what this is a modern village, but just on the edge of the village, the original Churches of Bassa, is what is a hill, a small hill, but originally surrounding it was a lake. Now, much of that lake has dried up. Over the years, the land has been drained to reclaim farmland, and some of the original lake survives as pools. But this hill that now stands there was once an island in the middle of the lake, and that has to have been the original Churches of Bassa where the kings from Viriconium were buried. Another reason we know this is because the limited archaeology that's taken place there has shown that it was reoccupied, used in some way around 500 AD, but not for defensive purposes, because although there is a bank and ditch built around the island, the ditch is on the inside of the bank, which is the opposite way round. It's as if you were building something for defensive purposes. You put the ditch or the moat outside the embankment, which would have had stockade on top, not on the inside. But they were put on the inside if they were for some form of religious or ceremonial purposes. So this does seem to have been a grave site of some kind, although not enough archaeology has ever taken place there to prove it one way or the other. But it is an island. It does make sense. We're told it's the churches of Bassa. It's called Bass Church. So if the man Owen, who was the historical Arthur, was a king who ruled from Viriconium, the most likely place for him to have been buried was the churches of Bassa. And incredibly, there's an old poem that survives, also preserved in the same manuscript at Oxford University, almost 1,500 years old, that tells us that Owen was buried in an area which was roughly an acre in land, which was like a field on a hill. Well, there is only one place at the churches of Bassa, at Bass Church, that matches that description. And so it's never been dug up. And what I wanted to do was to find out, is this poem real? Is he really buried there? You know, this was like his funeral song, if you like. Is it true? Was he really buried there? And if so, I could find the burial site of the person behind the Arthur legend.
Our guest this evening, Graham Phillips. The book is The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon. Graham, we have another call on the line, a 909 area code. Please give us your first name and where you are calling from. You are now live on The Secret Teachings.
My name is Michael, and I'm calling from Sugarloaf, California.
Hey there, Michael. You have a question for Graham Phillips?
I do. Well, yes. Here's what trips me out about the whole thing, is that, if I'm not mistaken, there was 12 people around the round table. Is that a fair statement?
It changes. There are different legends, but there's a thing that's supposed to be the round table, which hangs on a wall in southern England, a place called Winchester. I think that's got 24 places, but that's a fake anyway. But 12 is often a number they say, yes.
Right. Well, so I mean, it would go with other mythology to have your 12 disciples around you and your 12 people around you. I'm curious how you feel about that, and how, I mean, it comes up over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I'm convinced, like as you're suggesting, that during the Middle Ages, the idea of 12 knights plus Arthur and his round table is inspired in some way by Jesus and his 12 disciples.
And you have the 12 houses of the zodiac animal wheel, a circle, a round circle. It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, it's where much of Christian legend was based on earlier pagan legend, earlier Greek and Babylonian myths. So yeah, that's very true. There's also the other thing, of course, is in many of the early paintings of the Arthurian story, you've got Arthur sitting there with his 12 knights, and in front of him is the Holy Grail, the chalice, the very cup that was said to have been used by Christ at the Last Supper. So it's clear that this is a Christianization of some story. So is it just added up, made up, and put into it in the Middle Ages? What is really interesting is in Celtic Britain, 1,500 years ago, the Celtic people, according to the Romans, the leaders, the tribal leaders, had a custom of seating themselves in a circle around a cauldron, and they would share from drinks from this cauldron in order to prove that they were all equal and they all trusted each other and no one was going to poison anybody. And I believe that that was the original setting of the Arthurian story, of these Celtic warriors seated around a cauldron which then in the Middle Ages had to become Christianized, because by that time, pagan and Christians had very truly become separated,
Right.
so that
Yeah,
the
well, of
Roman
course.
Catholic
Yeah.
Church was,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
had to be appeased.
Yeah, cool, man. I just wanted to bring that up, and you know, great show as always, Ryan. Thank you, and thank you, everyone, and etc.
All right,
Thank
have a
you,
good
sir.
So
night.
cool. All
Bye-bye.
right.
All right, Graham. So we'll take a break here in just a moment. Come back with. I'm guessing. Can you do another? Can you do the rest of the show another hour, or can you only do about a
I'm
half
going to
hour?
have to go in about 10 minutes because people are starting to get up and
Okay.
children are running around. So I'm terribly sorry, but I can tell you about the ultimate part of the quest in a moment.
Sure, absolutely. And in fact, I have one or two other questions here. If you could just briefly touch on them. I was going to ask about the round table because that is sort of a legend in and of itself, but also the aspect of the Holy Grail. You touched on that. Maybe, I guess, in the last 10 minutes here, well, why don't you just go ahead and take the reins and take us anywhere you'd like to take us, explain a little bit about the conclusions, perhaps, or anything that you would like to talk about within this book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot and the Isle of Avalon.
Well, I've already told you about the Camelot that I seem to have identified, because archaeology has now come to the point where we're able to say where somebody of Arthur's time would have ruled from, the city of Viraconium, which is, as I say, now open to the public. You can go round there. It's very near a town called Shrewsbury in central England. And that Avalon, the place where the historical Arthur, Owen, whose title was Arth, the Bear, came from, is about 8 miles north of there. The question is, was Owen, is there really a burial site where the poem says Owen was buried? Unfortunately, the actual land upon which the burial site, the alleged burial site is private land. It's also a protected monument because it's known to have had historical associations so long ago. There's the government have slapped a preservation order on it, so you can't just go and dig it up without very special permission. Even if you're the local farmer, you can't dig down and look for artifacts or any kind of archaeological discoveries. But luckily enough, today the science has advanced to the extent that what we can now see what lies in the soil without the need to dig. The science is called geophysics. It involves things such as ground penetrating radar. If you imagine some sort of really glorified metal detector which can detect anything underground rather than just metal, that is what ground penetrating radar is. And of course it goes much deeper. And I managed to organize a geophysics survey using ground penetrating radar and other equipment to see what was actually under the ground at the site without digging, where it is said that Owen was buried. And over a period of a day, the archaeologists surveyed with this equipment this acre of land. And right in the middle, they discovered something really interesting. They could tell by the changes in the soil that a ditch at some point had been dug, a circular ditch about 6 feet wide and about 6 feet deep. Now, we know from other archaeological finds that the way of burying important high status individuals 1500 years ago was in circular graves. So this appeared to be a consistent grave from the period. What was absolutely fascinating is right in the center of this circular ditch, they found that was a large piece, a large iron object, buried right at the bottom of it. And it was probably, they'd guessed, the central boss, the central part of a shield. And we also know from archaeological evidence that warriors of the period were buried on their sides with a shield on their arm. So it is almost certain that what was in, and it's the only one there, what was in the center of this particular acre of land, known as Travail's acre, the acre of mourning, in other words, there is a single grave consistent with something of a high status person or a king dating from around 1500 years ago. And this is exactly where we're told that Owen van Gwyn is buried. And Owen, remember, is the man who was called Arth, the man who, in my opinion, is almost certainly the character upon whom the legend of King Arthur is based. In other words, I think that we have found his last resting place.
Now, the big question I had for you tonight, Graham, is that in this book, The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot, and the Isle of Avalon, you can find links to Graham's website on our website, or you can simply just go to your search engine or your URL and type in grahamphillips.net. That's grahamphillips.net. And that is over the hundreds and 1,000+ years of these myths and these legends and these stories. What is it about your book in particular and your work in particular that is so different from all of the others who may have come before you? Maybe there's just a few of them, but what is it that makes you so sure that you may have actually found the lost tomb of King Arthur amidst all of the possible hoaxes and deception prior to?
What's happened before is people who've searched for Arthur have either been literary figures who've examined, literary scholars, people who examined the development of literature. They've looked at the story of Arthur from, the point of view of the literature about him, literary scholars, or they've been historians who have searched for documented evidence for Arthur's existence. And then there's been archaeologists. And archaeologists have dug up the ground looking for anything that might prove Arthur was real or prove he didn't exist or anything else. So you've got three completely separate disciplines. In fact, you've got four if you take in the folklorists, people who study myths and legends in their own right. But the problem is that these scholars never really seem to sit down with each other. They're brilliant at what they do. I mean, historians have found ancient documents that you would never think they could find and put them all together, translated them. Archaeologists have done a tremendous job of excavating areas and discovering things that we just couldn't have guessed about a few years ago. But they all seem to really just don't get on with each other. What I tried to do was take an overall perspective to talk to each of these people who have done great work in their own right, but put it together, which nobody else had ever done. In other words, many of the clues as to who Arthur really was already existed and were already discovered by historians and archaeologists, folklorists and literary scholars. But these pieces of the jigsaw, if you like, were all separated. And what I did was to put them all together. And I think that's what makes my book different to those that have gone before.
Graham Phillips, our guest this evening. Graham, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Hopefully we can have you back sometime. I'd like to get into this a little bit more in detail, but thank you for joining us early in the morning where you are, grahamphillips.net. Tell the listeners where they can get a copy of the book or maybe some of your other work.
Well, all of my works, if you go to my website, grahamphillips.net, on the front page you will see covers, pictures of all the covers of my books. All you have to do is click on any of those, including this Arthur book that I've been talking about, and you'll see a good few pages telling you the general outline of what the book's about, plus pictures. So you don't really need to read the book first to find out what it's all about. But then there's links there about where you can order the books. I mean, obviously they're all available on Amazon, the Lost Tomb of King Arthur, or it can also be got from the publisher, which is Inner Traditions. But basically, go to grahamphillips.net and it's all explained.
Fantastic. Graham, thank you so much. You have a good day, and hopefully we'll talk to you again.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
There goes Graham Phillips, author of The Lost Tomb of King Arthur, The Search for Camelot, and the Isle of Avalon. His website, as he mentioned, is Graham Phillips. That's Graham Phillips with 2 L's, Phillips.net. You can find a link to Graham's website if you're already on thesecretteachings.info. That's our website, www.thesecretteachings.info. Go to the website, subscribe today, become a member of the Secret Teachings, get access to our insider videos, get access to our archive to download and stream all of our past shows on multiple devices. You can do that right now on the website.